The plot of the second proper episode of Transformers Prime is pretty straightforward. It's basically a bottle show consisting of only 2 primary locations, and it doesn't involve any asides to the Decepticons at all. What happens is, some replicators are brought back through the Stargate entirely by accident and end up infesting SGC, damaging the dialing computer, making it impossible to dial the Stargate and send help to a group stranded off-world. Oh, no, wait. Sorry, that's the wrong notes. What happens is a pod containing Scraplets is brought back through the ground bridge entirely by accident, and they end up spreading out and damaging the ground bridge computer so severely that they aren't able to open a ground bridge and rescue Optimus and RC, who are investigating the Arctic. After all, they found the Cybertronian pod which contained the Scraplets before they knew that it had Scraplets in it in the Arctic, and so they think there might be some other Cybertronian tech there as well. But Cybertronians don't do well in extremely low temperatures, so they have a limited amount of time that they can stay there before they start to shut down, and the shutdown would most likely be permanent. So this leaves Ratchet, Bumblebee, Bulkhead, and the kids to deal with the Scraplets, which are these tiny, kind of cute-looking robot things that are kind of rat-sized based on the size relationship they show with the kids, which apparently eat anything metal, and that's why they've been doing damage to the systems. But then later we see stuff from their point of view, and they go after the heat signatures from Transformers specifically, which seems to contradict that. There are a bunch of them, probably thousands of them, based on the size of the pod that they found, at least that's what Ratchet says. We certainly don't ever see thousands of them. And they can supposedly devour a Transformer in seconds, even though we never see that happen either, despite the fact that they get onto the Transformers multiple times. You may have gathered from the way that I handled the introduction to this episode, but I find this kind of plot to be very derivative at this point. And I specifically used an example from Stargate, even though that wasn't taken from any specific episode of Stargate, because the Stargate version of this type of creature, the Replicators, is a genuinely interesting example of this type of creature done right. Yes, they did eventually get stale. Eventually, having Replicators in an episode of the show just kind of made you roll your eyes, but they were still certainly more interesting than the Scraplets. Anyone who knows anything about writing tropes knows that tropes can be good or bad, and there are certain tropes that go along with this sort of infestation plot, which make the plot interesting, which should always be kept around. The creatures tend to come in large numbers, they tend to be able to hide. Those things do at least make it into this story. But usually creatures of this type have some way of multiplying. They have some way of replicating themselves or spreading their influence. Take the Thing from another world, or just The Thing, like from the movie The Thing by John Carpenter, as an example, as the start of this episode does very much resemble the start of that movie. Let's take the movie specifically as an example. In that movie, the Thing from another world was able to effectively assimilate people, was able to transform them into extensions of itself, and was able to spread through the base in that way. The Replicators from Stargate are able to eat materials and then use them to construct more of themselves. The Scraplets aren't able to do that. There are a set number of them, and once that set number is gone, the Scraplets are gone. So immediately the tension is lowered. A story like this one should have a certain number of expendable characters as well. Not too many of them. You don't have to have too many of them. Let's take Stargate as an example again. In Stargate SG-1, there's a whole bunch of unnamed base personnel running around all the time who can be victims of the Replicators when they get inside. And you don't even have to show that many of them getting killed off. You just have to show a couple to hammer home that the threat of these creatures is genuine. In this episode, because we only have the Autobots and the kids, who are main characters, who we know are going to stick around, the threat of these things just never comes off as realistic. And the tension was lowered even more when, even though we had heard that these things can devour a Transformer in seconds, they get onto the Transformers. They start eating away at the Transformers, and they're on them for minutes, and they don't kill them. Like, there's obvious damage, and the Transformers are obviously in pain, but no one dies. And like I said, I didn't expect anyone to die, but that just makes it even more obvious that there are no stakes here, that nothing is ever going to permanently change as a result of these things being here. You expect a creature like this to shake up the status quo, even if for just one episode, and that just wasn't the case here. We have yet again the inability to send a ground bridge when somebody needs one. We have yet again a plot where the kids have to work with the Transformers for things to go optimally well. Because as it turns out, because these things only eat metal, they don't go after the kids. They ignore the kids pretty much completely. And so Jack is able to protect Ratchet as he's trying to get the ground bridge working, and the other kids are able to help guard the others as they go around and try to exterminate the Scraplets. And later, when it's discovered that the actual damage to the ground bridge is somewhere outside of the control room, the kids are able to go alone and fix it. That was probably the only clever resolution that this episode came up with. They tried to pass off Jack using a fire extinguisher to lower the temperature of the Scraplets so much that they shut down as a clever twist, but that's not how fire extinguishers work. Maybe if they were CO2 fire extinguishers, which they probably were, they might lower the temperature of the Scraplets a little bit, but it's implied that these things would only shut down instantly in Arctic conditions, and it certainly wouldn't lower their temperature enough to make it seem like they were in Arctic conditions. This is one of my least favorite tropes in fiction. The fire extinguisher is a freeze ray trope. And granted, it wasn't like super overused in this episode, but just seeing it here in an episode that by its nature should have been taken seriously and showed our heroes dealing with this threat intelligently, it just rubbed me the wrong way. But this does give them the idea to draw the Scraplets through the ground bridge now that it's back up and running and take them back to the Arctic so that they will shut down pretty much instantly and be a non-threat. This will also double as opening a ground bridge for Optimus and RC to come back through. And so Bulkhead lures the Scraplets through, even though there's no reason why they would go after him and not the other two Transformers that are in the same room. And even then, there's no way that they could possibly know that they got all the Scraplets. Like, there's no clever resolution here where they figure out that the Scraplets will shut down in cold temperatures faster than the other robots, and so lower the base's temperature and then go around picking the Scraplets off one by one afterwards, or something like that. Something clever like that. There's nothing like that in this episode. And I just don't buy that in that moment, Bulkhead was able to lure all the rest of them back through that ground bridge. It just doesn't make sense. All throughout the rest of the episode, they had split up and gone throughout the entire base. Why would they all be there at that exact moment? Like, granted, I'm making estimations, but we never see thousands of them. I don't know, this episode just really fell flat for me. I think the only things I really liked about it was the genuinely good use of the kids in the plot, and the moments that Optimus and RC spent in the Arctic as they thought they were shutting down, bonding and reminiscing, though that only took up at most like 5 minutes of screen time. Maybe if this episode had come later in the series when there were already some ancillary characters running around, characters who we didn't know if they were going to stick around, characters who might actually die, this episode might have worked better. But placing it so early in the series and ignoring some of the more integral tropes to this sort of story, it didn't work. This isn't an episode that I would say you should skip if you're watching through the show for the first time. It's certainly watchable. It's just, we don't learn anything of note here. The Scraplets are super uninteresting as an antagonistic force, and if you have seen other plots similar to this one, there's a very strong chance that you will be bored by this episode. Not even the stuff with Optimus and RC being trapped in the Arctic managed to add any tension to this episode, because one of those people is Optimus. Like, Optimus is a character who dies a lot, but there's no way he's going to die in the second proper episode and while he's not fighting. But I don't know, maybe there are people out there who like this episode more than